Okay, Avi Berkowitz, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. As is well known, you were one of the main contributors to the success of the negotiations that led to the Abraham Accords. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background. How did the whole thing begin? And if you don't mind, how did you end up with this fantastic gig?
So thank you for having me, and it's good to meet and speak and talk about a very exciting journey. I actually came a sort of not circular, but unfamiliar trajectory. I met Jared Kushner at a Pesach program in Arizona in 2011, playing basketball. So it wasn't, even at the buffet. It was actually on the basketball court. And I didn't know who he was at the time, but we got to talking and we won a few games together. And after that, he offered me to come work for him at Kushner Companies. And the rest has been a very, very exciting history. But so just as it relates to the Middle East team, I began working after being on the campaign. I joined the White House as Jared Kushner's assistant, and then ultimately took over for Jason Greenblatt when he left in the special representative role. And the president, who deserves the lion's share of the credit for this deal, and Jared Kushner as well, told the team in 2017 to put out a peace plan, one that would really resolve the conflict, not pretend to do so. And so the team at the time was Jared, Jason Greenblatt, Ambassador David Friedman, and myself. And we tried to put forth a plan that was realistic, that actually took into account the realities on the ground, and had a chance of success. And in doing so, when we were actually going through the region, Jared would meet with foreign leaders, and their main sort of message to him was, this has gone on for too long. And it wasn't just in the UAE, it wasn't just in Bahrain, it was throughout the region. And they're tired of it, and they would like to see a realistic proposal. And if they did see one, they would be open to potentially normalizing relations with Israel. And I think that's a very important sentiment, because it's sort of hard to know if there's real animosity between parties when a conflict has gone on as long as it has. And I think in some scenarios, there is real animosity, and that needs to be worked through. But a lot of people just want better lives and to get to know one another and to move past the conflict. And so by putting out the plan, what I think Jared was able to do was set up a scenario whereby the Palestinians were given a realistic opportunity. Unfortunately, since December of 2017, when the president announced that we were going to be recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and moving our embassy there, they decided to no longer engage with us. And I am the person who is responsible to engage with them. So I can tell you it's sort of a complicated situation. But ultimately, that inability or unwillingness to engage was seen by a lot of regional partners as an inappropriate way to handle discourse, right? If you disagree with someone, the best way to make that known is, in our opinion, is to engage, and a lot of our regional partners agreed. And so and I apologize for a very long answer, but by setting up this sort of groundwork, we were really able to put out a plan, show the world that Israel is willing to make peace, and then actually show the world that Israel can make peace and did make peace with the UAE, and then ultimately with Bahrain. And so it's a very exciting opportunity, and we're glad that it came when it did.
Let me ask you, thanks a lot for that. Let me ask you specifically about the Abraham Accords, with the UAE and Bahrain. What were the main hurdles, and when in the process did you actually start to think, this might actually work?
So I have somebody on my team. His name is Scott Leith, and every single day when he would come in, when we were doing the negotiations, we had sort of like a game where we would say, what percentage do you think are the chance that we're going to get this deal done? And this is during the month of July and August. And we rarely got higher than about 85%. And he's a very optimistic, and I'm a very optimistic person, but these deals are so complex and they have so many different components to them that it's hard to know with any real degree of certainty that you've accomplished something until I've said, until I was sitting in the Oval Office with the president and Jared and hearing the president talking to the leaders, going through the actual, celebration of it, did I really allow myself to believe that it would happen. And even then, I'll be honest with you, that to me wasn't when the deal was done. It was done on September 15th, I think, when it was actually signed at the White House. And because these things can drag out and they can get lost. And just seeing the other day, yesterday, Israel's cabinet voting unanimously to move forward, and now the Knesset also is going to vote on Thursday. I know it's going to happen, but I'd like to see it actually happen before I'm willing to take a sigh of relief.
Right. By the time we, this is actually shown, we'll know the answer to that. My guess is it's going to be okay. I don't think you have to worry about that.
Okay, I'm glad.
Okay, so you can relax for now. But there must have been a lot of lessons here for there was so many failed efforts at Middle East peace and so many predictions of a new Middle East, going back to the 90s that blew up in our faces. What do you think was different? What did you guys do differently this time that made it work?
Yeah, so I don't know a lot of the people who have worked on these deals in the past, just sort of passing hellos in hallways and things of that variety. And so I always am hesitant to judge what they did and how we did it differently, because I don't know enough to be a relevant critic on their work. But what I do know is, specifically as it relates to our work, I would say Jared Kushner and the president. So the president, he wasn't necessarily involved in the day-to-day back and forth, but what we were negotiating with was the capital that he built, right? The relationships that he created with the leaders in the region by standing behind Israel with the Jerusalem move, with the Golan move, with leaving the Iran deal, right? Things of that variety, where the people of Israel, but mostly the leadership of Israel, was able to see that there was a partner, a real ally, somebody who stood behind his word. And then similar with the UAE, in addition to leaving the Iran deal, numerous other things that didn't become public, but ways that we had interacted with them to show them that we were good faith actors. And so using that relationship, right, that the president created, that was what made this, I think, possible. But then on the sort of negotiating the day-to-day level, which was led by Jared and then myself, I think it was honesty. I think it was a real sense that the person across the way was someone that you could really trust. And even if Israel and the UAE didn't know each other, a lot of people have said, well, there's these under the table discussions. I'll tell you from my personal experience, that was not the case. It was really the US led the mediation efforts under Jared Kushner's leadership. And the sides, they knew each other, but they didn't have that degree of comfort with one another that I think is very important when making a deal. And so I really believe that it was the trust that they had in Jared and myself, and the fact that I like to believe that we're very honest people. I think that was ultimately the main sticking point in how this deal was actually able to get done.
Got it. Okay, so let me ask you about the relationship between the Abraham Accords and the Trump vision. They're not the same thing. One is a vision, the other is an actual accord. Do you see the Accords as part and parcel of that vision, as somehow completing it, or is there a little bit of tension between them? And if I might challenge you just a wee bit, please. One of the advances that many people in Israel saw in the vision was the extension of Israeli law to certain parts of Judea and Samaria, which is now suspended. We're not exactly sure what the word suspended means. So how do you see that playing out? Do you think that part of the Trump vision is kind of off the table for now, or was that actually leverage in order to get the Accords? I mean, how do you see? Where's the connection?
So, as part of, I think, the honesty component, I think it's important to keep the timeline here. It's very important. When the plan was put out, it was put out because the administration has a fundamental belief on the best realistic way to resolve this conflict. And the vision for peace is the administration's position and remains the administration's position. So the notion of, applying Israeli law to areas of the West Bank, it's not something that we fundamentally disagree with. In fact, it's not something that we fundamentally would support. But after doing that, after putting out that vision, what became apparent was that in order to capitalize on this, momentous, I think, historic opportunity, it was necessary to suspend a component of the vision for peace. Now, that's not to say that in the foreseeable future, it could not come back. And that's not to say that we fundamentally disagree with what our position was initially. In fact, we still stand behind that position, and it's very important to us. And I think everybody should understand that. But understanding that certain opportunities arise when they do, and taking advantage to capitalize on them, i.e. the Abraham Accords, is also, was paramount in this case. So that's sort of a complicated way of saying the vision for peace is the Trump administration's plan. It is something that we will always stand behind. And it's my sincere hope that we have the opportunity to stand behind it for the next 4 years and work towards its implementation. However, for the time being, the application of Israeli law has been suspended so that we can focus on capitalizing on the normalization and peace agreements.
Well, it would be great if, as you say, you've got another 4 years to see the vision through. But
Yeah.
let me ask you, nevertheless, what do you think is the danger of a different administration that might have different views towards Israel and Iran and the Middle East in general, in terms of how the vision would play out, in terms of, the success of the Abraham Accords going forward?
Yeah, so it's something that I think everybody in my position would have to contend with, the possibility that someone else would come in and have a different foreign policy agenda or thought process. I was appreciative when the Biden camp put out a positive statement in support of the Abraham Accords, because it actually showed that this is something that has bipartisan support in the United States, which is a necessary, or at least helps ensure that the Abraham Accords will have a future that, it extends beyond however long our time in government is. And that's extraordinarily important. And, whether I'm in government or not, it would always be my pleasure and honor to help with whomever is working to advance that goal, because it's something that is not administration specific in my mind. It's something that is just good. And so things that are good should be pursued, ideally. And it's something that I hope to always be proud of, that it continues. And I hope more countries come aboard, whether we're here or not. I don't feel a sense of ownership that it has to be us that are the ones that make peace. As long as more peace is happening, that would be a great thing. As it relates to the vision for peace, the criticism is at least helpful because it shows you where other administrations would potentially lean. And specifically the Iran deal, the other side has criticized us for leaving it. And so it's at least reasonable to deduce that it's something that they consider to have been a success, despite what we consider to be a large amount of evidence to point in the opposite direction. And so I am nervous, if I'm just being completely honest, that a different administration would continue to pursue sort of appeasement type strategy with Iran, and whether its intention is so or not, it's hard to imagine that would not have negative ramifications on the normalization efforts, because even if it could sort of behind the scenes cause Israel and its regional partners to feel more aligned, the United States is the United States, and having a strong United States with, I think, the moral clarity in the region to push forward what is in the best interest of the US, but also in the best interest of Israel, does create opportunities like the one that we were able to seize upon thanks to the president and Jared of the Abraham Accords. And I think if you are in a world where the US is isolating its partners and allies in the Middle East, it becomes a lot more difficult to capitalize in the ways that we were able to. And so that's just a significant fear of mine that I hope will never be realized, because I think it could not be more important that President Trump be the one in charge of these things.
Okay, well, we've got an agreement with the with the Emirates and with Bahrain. Which countries might be next?
That is the question I get asked most. If I were someone who went to dinner parties, I think that would be the type of thing that I would be hit with the most. But I've luckily been able to avoid meeting too many people. We're in negotiations with a few other countries right now. Time is obviously a relevant component, these deals. And the beauty of the UAE deal, what was so instrumental about it, I think, coming to fruition, was the fact that nobody knew about it outside of a very select group of people that worked for Jared and then on the Israel and the UAE side as well. And the surprise factor wasn't just because it allowed us to frame what the actual deal was in reality, because sometimes what happens is if somebody doesn't like a component of something, so they'll just leak out that, which will make it seem like the deal is worse than it actually is. So in addition to that component, it also allowed the parties to speak freely amongst each other. And if you were to ask us at a specific snapshot, it's sort of like the story I mentioned earlier with Scott. We were at 65%. You might think that things were going in a bad way when really that's just how deals go. They take time and they're up and down and they're complicated. And so I've obviously seen the news stories about Sudan and Saudi, Morocco, Oman, other countries as well. But I'd prefer to allow whichever countries we may be talking with the privacy to actually, really have these free discussions without the fear of things being leaked in ways that could harm the deals.
I had zero expectation of actually getting an answer to that question. I was just checking your diplomatic skills. You passed with flying colors.
Okay, yeah.
You passed. That was awesome. That was the greatest non-answer ever. Anyway, Avi, you're a young guy. How are you going to top this?
I think about that too. I don't like, I guess the question almost requires a little bit of arrogance to think that I've done so much. I've been part of a tremendous team of people who have made what my element of this accomplishment possible, specifically the president and Jared Kushner, who I've mentioned him a few times, but I have just such respect and appreciation to him. He really deserves so much credit. And I also deal with a lot of the media that he gets. So I see the criticisms, and it's sort of mind-boggling when you compare the amount of success that he's had to the absurdity of the criticism without them ever coming back on the flip side when he actually helps make peace in the Middle East. So I'll just take that quick second to congratulate him. But as it relates to me, I think about these things a lot. I hope that I will be forever surrounded by as many smart and accomplished people as I've been up until this point, so that I can continue to grow with them and accomplish more things.
Okay, well, we wish you much continued success, and thanks very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. It's great talking to you.
Okay, pleasure.